This message comes from Mint Mobile. Starting at $15 a month, make the switch at mintmobile.com/switch. $45 upfront payment for 3 months. 5 gigabyte plan equivalent to $15 a month. Taxes and fees extra. First 3 months only. See terms.
What's good? You're listening to Code Switch. I'm Gene Demby.
I often hear the joke, "I'm in the wrong timeline," used to describe the bizarre nature of the news these days. And in the past week, I found myself saying it quite a bit.
Jasmine Garsd is an immigration correspondent for NPR. You've probably heard her on Code Switch a bunch in the past. She's one of our play cousins.
I first thought about it when I woke up at 4 a.m. on January 3rd. It was a Saturday, the first Saturday of the year. And my apartment in Queens, outside, it was really quiet, like the kind of quiet right after New Year's. And I'd gotten a text message from a dear friend of mine in Venezuela. It seemed that the capital city of Caracas was under attack. The U.S. military had entered the country, and the now deposed President Nicolás Maduro and his wife had been taken into custody. Now, by that evening, Maduro and his wife were a few miles away from my house at the Metropolitan Detention Center, also known as MDC, in Brooklyn. I rushed to cover the news, and I got a text from my friend in Caracas telling me she was okay and repeating what now feels like an old joke. "Girl, I don't know what alternate timeline we're in." Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, were to be indicted in federal court in southern Manhattan. Now, I've worked there before. I've covered President Trump's indictment and the Ghislaine Maxwell case. In many ways, this was a run-of-the-mill assignment. Get to court as early as possible, hand over your electronics, stand in line, rush into the courtroom, wait for the judge, plaintiffs, defendants to come in, look over the shoulder of a sketch artist sitting in front of you, reflect on how you may have a phone addiction as you keep jonesing to look at yours. But the minute Maduro walked into the courtroom, normalcy was out the window. He is an imposingly tall man. He strolled in confidently, almost lionesque, and he was wearing his prison uniform. He looked at reporters in the eye, and several times in English, he said, "Happy New Year." So, looking Nicolás Maduro in the eye as he wished me a Happy New Year was definitely not on my list of ways 2026 might start. I searched my pockets, and then I remembered I had no phone, so I made a mental note to tell my friend in Caracas, "Now I, too, am in your alternate timeline." It turns out covering courts is absolutely nothing like in the movies. There are long bureaucratic back and forths. There's something about the dark wood and the velvety carpets of the courthouses that I find dangerously nap-inducing. But this brief 30-minute session was electrifying. Maduro described himself as the current president of Venezuela and a prisoner of war kidnapped by the U.S. Army. And as he spoke, a heckler in the audience quipped something. We were all subjected to a stern lecture from the court officer about not interrupting. Sitting at the same table as Maduro was his wife, Cilia Flores. Now, her right eye seemed bruised. Her forehead was bandaged. Her lawyers requested medical attention for what they said might be a bruised rib or perhaps a fracture, which they said was sustained during the U.S. military operation. As the proceedings came to an end, Maduro got up, he was escorted out, and that same heckler, stood up and told him, "Vas a pagar por lo que le hiciste al pueblo venezolano." You will pay for what you've done to the people of Venezuela. And Maduro turned back and responded, "I am a man of God," and reiterated that he is a political prisoner who has been kidnapped by the U.S. Two reporters who didn't speak Spanish turned around to me and said, "What just happened?"
And that's what we're getting into today. Because what just happened? Jasmine is going to walk us through what she saw inside and outside of that courtroom in Manhattan where the deposed president of Venezuela was being indicted. And a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian helps us zoom out and explains the longer sweep of history in which the United States has intervened in the affairs of Venezuela and Latin American countries like it.
Support for this podcast and the following message come from Indeed. Hiring isn't just about finding someone willing to take the job. You need a person with the right background who can move your business forward. Spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Receive a $75 sponsored job credit with Indeed Sponsored Jobs at Indeed.com/codeswitch. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Do it the right way with Indeed. This message comes from Mint Mobile. This holiday season, stop overpaying for wireless and switch to Mint. Shop 50% off unlimited plans at mintmobile.com/switch. Limited time offer. Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12 months. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Above 35 gigabytes, network may slow when busy. Capable device required. Availability, speed, and coverage varies. See mintmobile.com.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Sierra. No matter the industry, how businesses connect with customers defines their brand. And today, connection starts with a conversation. Sierra is the platform for businesses that want to provide better, more human customer experiences with AI. With Sierra, your AI agent solves problems fast. No stock answers, no hold music. Visit Sierra.ai to learn more.
All right, Jazz, that sounds bananas, like so surreal.
It really was. And then, I had to sprint out of the court so that I could go live on NPR. And it was freezing and icy. Like, the floor was pretty icy. And I had to elbow my way through a sizable and quite agitated crowd that had gathered in front of the courthouse.
Tommy, why you don't go to Venezuela and live there? Why you don't go to Venezuela and live there if you so in love with Maduro?
So in that sizable and agitated crowd, there were lots of protesters. What kind of things were they saying?
I'm out here today to demand the release of President Nicolás Maduro, to demand the release of the first combatant, Celia Flores, and to demand the U.S. takes its hands off of Venezuela. No war, no sanctions.
The United States is not the world's police. We do not have the right to be detaining and arraigning and kidnapping the head of a foreign nation, meddling in their politics. Venezuela is a sovereign country, and the destiny of Venezuela is for Venezuelans to decide, not the United States.
The crowd was like this microcosm of the feelings and opinions swirling around this issue. I mean, there were protesters against the American attack on Venezuela saying, how could we go into another country and just take someone off the streets? As an immigration reporter, I thought to myself as I heard that, well, we've been doing that every day here in this country.
Huh, yeah.
And there was also a crowd of Venezuelans celebrating the downfall of Maduro.
Venezuela, real sentimiento, sangre, amor, amor por mi país. Y estoy feliz.
As I tried to push my way through, I heard words I myself grew up around as a South American. Give or take the name of the country and the U.S. foreign policy du jour.
Right.
There was rage at American intervention, which has a long and troubling history in our continent. And there was anguish. There was the real anguish of a people who have spent generations under the boot of a dictator.
Ven a nuestro país. Ven a nuestra gente comer de la basura. ¿Cómo se llama? Y que viva Venezuela. María Su. María Su.
I met a woman named Maria Su who's been in the U.S. since 2017. She explained to me that she had been an engineer in Venezuela and she had refused to align with the Maduro party, and she felt that she had to leave.
No te puedo explicar la felicidad. Yo creo que no tengo una palabra que represente la felicidad que representó para mí ese día. Solo te puedo decir que ha sido el día más feliz de mi vida.
She said to me, I can't explain the joy that I have. I don't think there is a word. I don't have a word to describe the joy I am feeling. All I can tell you is that this is the happiest day of my life. And she was really thankful for this intervention.
Y apoyo 100% a Donald Trump.
And what she's saying here is, I'm really happy. I support Donald Trump.
Apoyo y le doy gracias a los marines, le doy gracias al ejército norteamericano por habernos quitado la peor plaga que ha existido en Venezuela, el socialismo. Y confío plenamente en Donald Trump y confío plenamente en el secretario Marco Rubio.
I support and I thank the Marines, the U.S. Marines. I give thank you to the American Army for having taken away from us the worst plague that has existed on Venezuela, which is socialism. And I trust in Donald Trump. I trust in him completely. I trust in him. I trust in Marco Rubio. I know that they have a plan that will work.
Y yo sé que el plan que ellos tienen va a funcionar y sé que Venezuela va a ser el país soñado que todos queremos con el apoyo de Estados Unidos.
I mean, my first reaction is like, whoa, this person is obviously a big Trump supporter, as he said, right?
Yeah, I think it's also, something, if I could critique some of the coverage of these protests. I mean, the people a lot of times who show up to these protests feel very, very strongly on an ideology, on a political ideology.
Of course,
I mean,
that makes sense, yeah.
You have to take time off on Monday morning, on a freezing Monday morning, to go stand outside of a courthouse. What's interesting to me is conversations I've had in private with Venezuelan friends and colleagues who are just kind of processing everything and experiencing, deep joy, discomfort, fear, mourning, sadness, anxiety, like all of the feelings. And it's, like a nuance of emotions. And so I think, like I said, when you go to one of these crowds, you get this like microcosm of feelings on all the extremes, because those are the people who are showing up on a freezing Monday morning in front of the courthouse. I'm not trying to undermine her feeling of relief.
Absolutely.
I think it's also really interesting to talk to Venezuelans who are processing the nuances of this.
Mm-hmm. I think there's also this thing that happens a lot when people have left a country, right? Not of their own volition. Right. You're also getting a universe of people who have really strong opinions about the leadership of the country that they left for whatever reason, right? I mean, Vietnamese Americans tend to be really anti-communist, because of the conditions of their leaving, right? Like those things, they show up domestically in the opinions differently than they might actually in Caracas or somewhere else.
Sure. I mean, you're seeing it through a lens of your own experience. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've spent the last maybe 3 years interviewing even Venezuelans as they are crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, right? Like on the last of this trip through the Darien and leaving, who have said to me, I always think about this one woman who had a baby and who said to me, here's the deal, like in Venezuela, I have to make a decision every day. Do I feed my kid lunch or dinner? Mm-hmm. And so I think that a lot of times, like, we're just living in this reality with social media, and there's not an allowance for very complicated feelings, right? And most Venezuelans I've spoken to in private about this are feeling are feeling very uncomfortable on a lot of levels. Like they're just feeling a lot of different, like a universe of feelings. And that's not kind of what rises to the top in our media ecosystem. And so as I was pushing through this crowd and hearing these things that I've been hearing my whole life as a South American, it dawned on me that the joke isn't that we're in an alternate timeline. It's how long we've been stuck on this one.
When we come back,
no one who works in Latin America could be surprised that the United States is intervening in Latin America. I mean, Maduro isn't the first president that's been captured by U.S. military and swept out of his country.
Stay with us.
This message comes from Jerry. Many people are overpaying on car insurance. Why? Switching providers can be a pain. Jerry helps make the process painless. Jerry is the only app that compares rates from over 50 insurers in minutes and helps you switch fast with no spam calls or hidden fees. Drivers who save with Jerry could save over $1,300 a year. Before you renew your car insurance policy, download the Jerry app or head to jerry.ai/NPR. This message comes from MIDI Health, a virtual care platform for women in perimenopause and menopause. CEO Joanna Strober shares the mission behind working with women in midlife.
We are very much a holistic care platform, and our job is to figure out whatever medications are appropriate for you and offer you those medications. It's not just about hormones. It's not just about weight loss medications. It's really understanding all of the medication options and making sure that you get access to the right ones.
Discover how MIDI can help care for you at joinmidi.com. Support for NPR and the following message come from Warby Parker, the one-stop shop for all your vision needs. They offer expertly crafted prescription eyewear, plus contacts, eye exams, and more. For everything you need to see, visit your nearest Warby Parker store or head to warbyparker.com.
Gene this week, Code Switch. We just heard some very intense reactions from Venezuelans and other folks who were outside the courthouse in New York City where President Nicolás Maduro and his wife were being indicted after the Trump administration captured the Venezuelan leader. A lot of those reactions were not just about Maduro, but about this longer history that predates him. And as our play cousin Jasmine Garsd mentioned earlier, the U.S. has been involving itself in the affairs of Latin American countries for a long time. So we called up an expert to walk us through that history.
No one who works in Latin America could be surprised that the United States is intervening in Latin America. I mean, Maduro isn't the first president that's been captured by U.S. military and swept out of his country.
That's Greg Grandin. He's a historian who's written a bunch of books about the U.S. and Latin America, including this title from 2 decades ago, Empire's Workshop, Latin America, the United States, and the Making of an Imperial Republic. His most recent book from last year is America, A New History of the New World. Here's what y'all need to know as a little primer before we get into this, okay? So Venezuela has about a fifth of all the proven oil reserves in the world, which allowed the country to kind of punch above its weight and allowed it to pay for a lot of things that the country needed to operate. Nicolás Maduro was elected Venezuela's president in 2013, following the death of Hugo Chavez. And in the decade that followed his election, the price of oil crashed. The economy of Venezuela tanked. President Trump put economic sanctions on Venezuela. And so nearly 8 million Venezuelans fled that country to make ends meet. And to shore up his fragile grip on power there, Maduro started cracking down on his political opponents and started relying more and more on the military there to help him stay in office. Then came the 2024 election.
Most polls suggest that Maduro lost that election by about maybe 60 to 40% or around there. And basically he just refused to release the results and announced himself the winner and stayed in power.
And that is one of the numerous justifications Trump has given for why he ordered the raid in Venezuela and the capture of Maduro and his wife, that Maduro is an illegitimate leader.
there's a lot of people illegitimately in power and power without elections that the United States works with on a regular basis. I mean, most of the Gulf states and China, the United States just pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was president of Honduras, who was in jail for drug running. Trump basically gave him a full pardon. And that was a long case that federal agents worked on in order to arrest and convict him. So, yes, Maduro is the tragic outcome of what was for many, an inspiring movement that went off the rails. And still the question is, who gets to decide the quality of another country's sovereignty? In some ways, Trump was cosplaying the role of a colonial plunderer. He went through the justification was immigration, then it was fentanyl and cocaine, and then he just settled on oil. We're going to take the oil. We're going to take the oil back. That's really ours. And in some ways, it's playing to the base. It's playing to a base that's suspicious of U.S. interventionism, right? An American first nationalism that sees itself as opposed to a kind of nation-building internationalism where the United States takes responsibility for rebuilding Iraq or rebuilding Afghanistan. But when you frame it in terms of, we're going to go get our oil, it sounds good to the base, right? It sounds like, why not? Why don't we go get our oil back? So, a lot of people made a big deal that Trump is just, he's saying the quiet part out loud. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's that simple. I think that what he was doing was he was landing on a justification that sounded good. If we wanted Venezuelan oil, then he would have listened to the people in his administration that says Maduro is willing to give you Venezuelan oil. All you have to do is normalize relations. You don't have to send in Delta Force from Fort Bragg, in an operation to take him out. I'm always a little suspicious of explanations for U.S. actions that are reduced to specific material interests, because there is no such thing, right? All material interests are always understood ideologically, right? And Venezuela was a country that was in crisis. As you said, millions of Venezuelans were fleeing the country. It was unsustainable. For a hegemon like the United States, it's intolerable to have a country like that on your hinterlands, on your borderlands. You almost have to do something about it. And I don't mean this in a moral way. I don't mean this in a kind of humanitarian way. It's just a kind of realpolitik way, that you can't have a country that is in constant crisis for over a decade. And then that crisis is spilling over in terms of the number of refugees that are coming into your country, that are coming into other countries. So something does have to be done. Now, the question is, what has to be done? Could Trump have normalized relationships with Venezuela and created a bit of stability and maybe provided a bit of humanitarian relief, lifted some of the sanctions, allowed them to sell oil, to get some food in that would reduce the number of immigrations? Of course he could have. Did he have to go in and kidnap Maduro, but then leave Maduro's state effectively in place? Like, what is that other than just this demonstration of power? Like he could have, whatever deals he's doing with Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president and former vice president, he could easily have done with Maduro. And Delcy Rodriguez is implicated in all of the quote unquote crimes that Maduro is implicated in as well.
You used the word sovereignty earlier when talking about the critics of the Trump administration's actions in Venezuela. And, that's an idea that comes up a lot when people talk about the U.S. getting involved in Latin America more generally.
Yeah.
But in your own research, you say the way we understand sovereignty today actually originated in Latin America.
Yeah.
Can you say more about that?
Well, that's a great question. The idea of sovereignty, it has deep roots and it had different meanings. But in its modern form, the notion of it attached to a modern nation state, it came from Latin America. Latin America, in its independence from Spain in the 1820s, in many ways was the first kind of, the United States broke from Great Britain. It was a republic, but it was a republic on a small stretch of the eastern seaboard of an enormous continent that the founders of the United States imagined as empty. Now, of course, it wasn't empty. It was filled with Native Americans. The Spanish Empire reached up into what is now the U.S. Southwest and California. But there was a notion that the United States was going to move west, right? That it was going to reach the Pacific. Latin America comes into being a little different. Latin America comes into being 7 or 8 nations already on a continent filled up, right? They had to learn how to live with each other, or else it would be kind of endless war under the terms of the old kind of laws of war. So they came up with this notion that every nation had the right to sovereignty. Now, they also lived in the shadow of an expanding United States that took Texas, that took Mexico, that took Cuba, that for a while invaded and took over Nicaragua and reinstalled slavery in a country that had abolished slavery decades earlier. There was this notion that Spanish America was going to be gobbled up by the United States. And in reaction to that, its jurists and its diplomats and its intellectuals became very committed to the idea of national sovereignty, that each country had the right to be left alone to work out its own problems. And for years, Latin America had tried to force the United States to accept that principle and to give up the right to intervention. The United States claimed the right to intervene in countries that it felt was, in turmoil or chronic wrongdoing. And this went on well into the 20th century. And it wasn't until 1933 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was president and there was a Pan-American conference in Montevideo in Uruguay in October. And it was the depths of the Great Depression. Roosevelt, who had aspirations of being a global leader, but, he just had 2 disastrous conferences in Europe, sent his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, down to Montevideo. And Hull extemporaneously accepted Latin America's demand that the United States give up the right to intervention and accept the absolute sovereignty in the domestic and foreign affairs of any nation, no matter what their size or no matter what their power.
So Hull just on his own decided this.
Yeah, it was this enormous turnaround in international law, and it created enormous goodwill. This was 1933, and it basically allowed Cordell Hull to negotiate free trade agreements that benefited the New Deal. The United States, in the meantime, tolerated economic nationalists within Latin America, Mexican revolutionaries who were nationalizing Standard Oil's holdings and creating what became now known as Pemex. So the idea of sovereignty, it has deep roots in political thought and political philosophy, and it comes to us from classical times. But its modern creation, as it applies in international law, was an invention of Latin America. And you can go and read the Charter of the United Nations, which was founded in 1945. And basically all of the principles in that charter, Latin Americans had been arguing for since the 19th century: an end to aggressive war, an end to the doctrine of conquest, the absolute right of sovereignty, and that the fundamental principle organizing the interstate order should be one that assumes cooperation and mutual interests rather than great power politics. And that all comes from Latin America. So the notion of sovereignty is very cherished in Latin America. And for a long time, the United States, it's the problem of law, right? That law is both this normative thing that supposedly exists in its own realm, but it's applied and enacted through power. What countries have power to be exempt from law? What countries have power to enforce law? So, obviously the United States didn't give up being a hegemon or didn't give up trying to pursue its own interests. But the acceptance of the doctrine of sovereignty allowed the United States to be a more effective hegemon, to learn how to use international organizations and what eventually becomes liberal internationalism in order to project its interests. So, the United States continued to intervene in Latin American affairs, but it either did so covertly, where it didn't admit it, through the CIA, or it used organizations like the Organization of American States to isolate Cuba, for example, after the Cuban Revolution. So it was still able to use the institutions of liberal internationalism and formally hold on to the doctrine of sovereignty, even as it was de facto figuring out ways, workarounds to violate it. But in terms of, who gets to decide, right? Who gets to decide that the quality of another country's sovereignty isn't worthy of respect? And under the terms, ideally, of the interstate system, it should be these multilateral bodies that do it, whether it be the United Nations, whether it be the Organization of American States. When the United States went into Iraq in 2003, it went to at least the formality of assembling a coalition that supported its goals. That was kind of outside of the formal structures of the international order, but at least it was a nod towards internationalism and some kind of consent of other countries. What you have with Trump, though, is a complete overturning of that, right? There's no consent needed, and there's no consent sought. And just the United States is going to decide what country is sovereign and what country isn't. And it's announced it fairly clearly. It's the National Security Strategy report that it put out a couple of weeks ago resurrected the Monroe Doctrine, but the Monroe Doctrine in its most bellicose terms, and really kind of left it to the United States to act as it would within the hemisphere.
I don't know if you saw that the tweet that the State Department put out this week. It's a photo of Donald Trump
striding the hemisphere with the Monroe Doctrine.
Well, I mean, it's pretty close. It's Donald Trump in black and white with the words layered on top of him, "This is our hemisphere," in red. Yeah. And it's like, oh, this is like legit, just straight up Monroe Doctrine iconography.
And the Monroe Doctrine has been used as a kind of standing warrant for the United States to intervene at will, but they still at least justified it in terms of we're doing it on behalf of protecting the New World, right? Like the Monroe Doctrine, the assumption of the Monroe Doctrine is that the New World, the Western Hemisphere, shares certain interests, and the United States will use its power to protect the New World from outside threats. The Donald Trump version of the Monroe Doctrine has jettisoned all of that. And it's like a property deed to the Western Hemisphere. Like you said, it's like our hemisphere now.
Just a few months ago, we talked about this very dramatic raid of a building on the south side of Chicago undertaken by federal agents. And in this apartment building that was decrepit and neglected, the people who lived in it were overwhelmingly Venezuelan migrants who had come to the United States. The Trump administration has changed a bunch of work visa policies that will make it much easier to deport about 700,000 possible Venezuelan migrants in the United States. If you could you talk about the connection between the sort of posture that the United States is taking towards Venezuela and how sort of raids like this it feels like those are bookends to each other, that they're sort of different ends of the same policy impulses.
Yeah. It's a pure exercise of power. It's a sense that the United States has dominion, and it doesn't have to justify its dominion. It just has to exercise it. And, the line between the foreign and domestic in many ways has collapsed under Trump. I mean, first it started with building his political movement around the wall and around migration. And now it's expanded to things like the raid in Venezuela and threatening Mexico that it's going to start firing missiles to destroy cartels. There's, now that, Trump is getting deeper and deeper into Latin American politics, even as it continues its very brutal actions in forcing people who fled unbearable conditions out of the country, and Lord knows where they'll wind up. I mean, people are being sent to third countries they have no connection with. It's just an intense version of a kind of tribal nationalism. People talk about America First nationalism, that doesn't want to get involved in boots on the ground wars or nation building wars, but are okay, with bombing countries, that are said to threaten U.S. interests and are okay with this notion of ramping up a very punitive and brutal deportation regime. During the Cold War, when refugees from countries that we were at odds with came to the United States, they were treated quite well. Cubans, for instance, and Nicaraguans. And what's a turnaround now is the way that even though the United States has identified Venezuela as a problem, it still affords no quarter for the people that have fled for a better life.
Greg Grandin is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian at Yale University. His most recent book is called America America, A New History of the New World. And that is our show. You can follow us on Instagram at NPR Code Switch. That's all one word. And if email's more your bag, ours is codeswitch@npr.org. And subscribe to the podcast on the NPR app or, wherever it is you get your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the Code Switch newsletter by going to npr.org/Code Switch newsletter. And just a reminder, signing up for Code Switch Plus is a great way to support our show and to support public media. I don't know if you heard, but we kind of need your help right now. And you get to listen to every episode of our show and other shows sponsor-free. That's a deal, right? So please go find out more at plus.npr.org/Code Switch. This episode you're listening to was produced by Christina Kalla and Jess Kung. It was edited by Daya Mortada and Christina Kalla, and our engineer was Ko Takasugi Chernovin. And we'd be remiss if we did not shout out the rest of the Code Switch Massive. That's Xavier Lopez, Leah Donnella, Verlin Williams, and B.A. Parker. As for me, I'm Gene Demby. Be easy, y'all.
This message comes from MIDI Health. Co-founders Joanna Strober and Dr. Kathleen Jordan discuss why they started a virtual care platform to empower and educate women in perimenopause and menopause.
Historically, perimenopause and menopause have been very stigmatizing. So people haven't wanted to admit that they're in perimenopause and menopause, as though it was embarrassing, which is insane. It's just something happening to your body, right? But we've been embarrassed about it. So one of the things that we're trying to do is destigmatize these topics. Perimenopause and menopause are just women's health. So what we try to do is we try to educate women all the time. Maybe it's your hormones, and we would like to help you.
Yeah, and I find women actually want to talk about it. It's one of the things they always comment at MIDI is that they finally feel heard. One of the ways that women find MIDI is actually from other women. That's actually a common way that people find us, and I think it's meaningful.
Discover how MIDI can help care for you at joinmidi.com.